Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. I've been playing around with rye bread lately, and I've finally put together a recipe that's just what I like. Crusty and chewy with a lot of caraway seeds and kind of tangy. You know, there are some tricks to working with rye flour, and I'll try to share some of them with you in this video. Here are the ingredients. Please pause and write them down. And hey, while you're paused, give us a thumbs up. And if you like our videos, subscribe and click the little bell at the top right of your screen, and you'll get a notice when I post new videos about twice a week. Now let's get baking. So here are the ingredients, and I'm going to take a little extra time to talk about these. I'm going to start out here with 2 cups of rye flour. I'm using the dark rye. Now, rye flour does have gluten, but it doesn't have a lot, and it's very fragile. So you always use another kind of flour with it. I have here 2.5 cups of bread flour, and I have a tablespoonful of vital wheat gluten. You may use all-purpose flour. Be sure you use the vital wheat gluten if you use all-purpose flour. You could skip the gluten if you're using bread flour, but I don't. This is 1 2/3 cup of warm water, about 90 degrees or so, and this is 1/3 cup of pickle juice. And believe it or not, the pickle juice is not just for flavor. It helps the rise. I also have a teaspoonful of sugar, 1.5 tablespoons full of yeast. This is instant yeast. You can use dry. And then 1 tablespoonful of salt. And I have here what gives the rye bread its flavor. This is caraway seeds. And that flavor that you associate with rye bread comes from caraway seeds. I have 2 tablespoons full, but 1.5 tablespoons full is probably enough. I probably went a little overboard, but I really love caraway seeds. So I'm going to show you how to proof the yeast. You don't have to proof it if you're using instant yeast, but in case you're using active dry, we're going to proof it. And my yeast has been in the freezer for almost a year, so I always proof it anyway, even though it's instant. So I poured in the water and the yeast and the sugar. And I'm just going to mix these together. And then I'm going to go away and leave them for about 5 minutes or so. And if your yeast is good, it will start to bubble and foam, and that proves that it's active. I use Red Star yeast, and this is the instant, and I buy it in the pound packages, and it does last about a year, but it will stay good if you keep it in the freezer. And if you use instant yeast, you can skip this step. You don't have to do it. You can just dump everything in the mixing bowl. But you saw that little foam, and that proves that this yeast is active. Now I'm going to pour in the rye flour. And I'll add the bread flour later, a little bit at a time, but I'm going to go ahead and put all of the rye flour in. And then I'll start adding the other ingredients. I'm going to add the vital wheat gluten. I'm looking for it, and it's back here. The vital wheat gluten. And then I'll add the caraway seeds and the salt. It probably doesn't really matter in what order you add these things. And then I'm going to pour in the pickle juice. Now, let me explain. Because the gluten in rye flour is a little different and a little fragile, the acid from the pickle juice actually helps the rise and helps it hold its rise. And it has a lot of salt in it too. So if you were not using pickle juice, and you don't have to, you would add a little more salt. But the pickle juice really helps the flavor too, so I recommend it. So I'm just going to put this in my beater, my mixer, with the dough hook and let it go. I will tell you that this bread doesn't take a lot of kneading, so if you want to just mix this all up in a bowl, feel free. It'll work just fine. My hands are old and sometimes they're sore, so I use the mixer every time I can. but it mixes really easily. You really could use just a bowl and a spoon and then get your hands in and finish mixing it. So I've got this on about speed 4, and I'm going to add the flour, a cup or so at a time, half cup to a cup at a time, just because it blends in a little easier and it's not quite so messy that way. And I'll scrape it down a couple of times. This is never going to have the texture of, say, white bread when you make it, which gets a real firm texture. And something else about rye flour that I will warn you about, unlike bread flour or making a white loaf of bread, you can overmix it. As I said, the gluten in rye flour is kind of persnickety. It's a little fragile, and it can be overmixed. So we're really not going to need this dough at all. We're going to mix it well, and when it all gets mixed together, that's it. We don't need it. So I'm going to add this in. I'll turn my mixer up just a little bit just to get it mixed in. And I'm going to do a little time lapse here because you don't want to watch the whole process. But I am going to show you enough of it so you recognize the difference in the texture, the elasticity of the dough. It's just not the same as making white bread. It doesn't look the same, it doesn't feel the same, and it doesn't rise the same. It's a totally different thing. And if you've had trouble making rye bread before, my guess is your results were kind of gummy. And that's what can happen if you overwork rye flour. You can end up with some gumminess in the middle that's not tasty and you're probably not happy with. So I'm going to put a little bit more in and mix it. I'll scrape it down a couple times. And I'm going to share a little personal issue here. I made a video for mostly following Julia Child's recipe for buttery white bread, and the video was 20 minutes long, and I get all kinds of comments that, oh, that's too long. And then I get other comments that say, thank you so much for showing me all the steps so I'll know what to expect. Okay, the last of the flour's going in here now. I'm going to turn it back up to about 4. So if you're watching my videos and it feels like it's too long for you, I just have to say, if you take 20 minutes to learn how to bake bread, that's really not long. To acquire a skill you'll use the rest of my life. And if you already know all the steps and you know what to expect, then just skip right on through it. You don't have to watch the whole thing. It's all right with me. So I'm going to scrape this from the bottom because it doesn't pull up on the dough hook the way white bread would. It's much gummier. It feels almost like chewing gum. It's pretty gummy. But that's okay because we don't want to overmix it. I pulled it up from the bottom just to make sure the bottom gets mixed really well. I'm going to let this run maybe another 30-45 seconds. And now we're done. We're going to stop. Not going to need it. This is what we're looking for. And then I'm going to turn this out on a floured board. This is my glass cutting board that I use for making bread. And it's really gummy and sticky. And it'll stick to my hands and it sticks to this scraper. But it won't take long to get rid of that gumminess. Really, just maybe a tablespoonful of flour added in will get rid of that gumminess. And while I'm mixing this, I'll tell you, I have my stove on to heat up the area around my stove. And I'm doing that because rye bread really should rise at a little higher temperature. You want it to rise just a little bit more quickly. Now, I know there are folks that make artisan rye bread and they let it rise 4 or 5 hours. But rye gluten will break down more quickly. And so you need to rise your bread pretty quickly. So you're looking to have an area that's about 78 degrees. Now, that's not exact. But you do want to have it a little bit warmer than you normally would. So I'm going to flour my hands a little here and just turn this pretty gently. I'm not going to work it too much. And just a couple of turns with this flour is going to make this easy to handle. It'll stop being sticky. It'll feel very velvety, almost like white bread. And I'm going to just form it into a ball here. And I've got my proofing bowl ready. If you've seen my videos, you know I have a big plastic bowl because I like to not have to use too much plastic wrap. Brushing the excess flour off. Now that's all it took to make this dough manageable. It's no longer sticky. I'm just going to pull it together at the bottom and form it into a ball. See, now it's just handling so easily. That texture just evened out and got right really quickly. So I've got a little oil, little olive oil, any kind of oil, in the bottom of this bowl. And I'm going to put this ball in upside down so that I get a little oil on the top, and then flip it over. And if you're just using a regular bowl, just cover it with some plastic wrap to keep it from crusting over. I'm going to put a little oil on this. You'd put a little oil on your plastic wrap to keep it from sticking. I don't think it's going to rise up to touch the top, but just in case, I put a little oil on it. And then I'll close two sides. That leaves enough opening for it to off gas as it forms carbon dioxide. I'm going to let this rise about an hour. The area is around 76, 78 degrees around my stove. I'll be back. It's been an hour. It's about doubled in size. It's nice and big and puffy. Now, you're going to want to resist the urge to punch this down. We're going to press it down gently. And we're not going to knead it anymore. We'll stretch it a little bit because we're going to be very gentle with that fragile rye gluten. So I'm just going to push it down and pull it gently out of the bowl. And I'm not going to use a rolling pin either. I'm just going to press this with my hands. All I'm doing right now is pressing out some air bubbles. And I'll stretch it and fold it a little bit. I mean, it's not going to break, but you just don't want to be rough with it. You want to handle it fairly gently. And it does have some air bubbles. So we want to get those out. And a good way to get it out is to stretch it. And here in just a second, I'll just stretch it out for you and show you what I mean. I'm just pulling it out. Get a little bit of flour, and I'm going to stretch that out. And then I'll roll it into a loaf. Now, this recipe would make 2 regular size bread loaves. I'm going to make one sort of freeform loaf and bake it on my cast iron skillet. Just because that's the way I want this loaf. I want it to be big and puffy. And all I'm doing is forming it, make sure the ends are pinched together. Don't want it to be too long because I want it to fit on my pan. And that looks about right. Don't want it to come loose on the ends, but you know, this is a very moist dough, so it's not likely to come loose. I've got here my cast iron breakfast skillet that I've had for 51 years. And I'm going to put a little cornmeal on it instead of oiling this, because the cornmeal will kind of hold it up from the surface. I'm going to show you this pan in a second. I didn't have it in the frame. And I'm using cast iron because most folks would put this on a baking stone, like a pizza stone. And I don't have one. And I'm not going to buy one. So I use cast iron, which has some of the same effect. You don't heat it ahead of time, though, because you're going to let it rise on the pan. But using cast iron gives you that, sort of simulates a baking stone. Not totally, not really, but sort of. And I just spread this cornmeal out because I don't want the bread to stick to the pan. I want it to sort of be raised up just a tiny bit so that the heat will go under it and make the bottom crispy also. And it fits right here, as I knew it would. I'm going to cover this with a tea towel, which I almost never use, a clean little microfiber towel. And this won't stick to this bread, which is why I almost never use tea towels. But with this dough, it's going to work just fine. And I ran the little towel under some warm tap water, and then I squeezed it out almost dry. I'm going to cover this and let it sit here. My kitchen's now about 75. I'm going to let it sit here for 30 minutes. This is the time of day the lighting on my counter gets wicked. I apologize for it, but I hope you can see. So it's risen up nice and puffy. Not like white bread, though. It's still more dense than that. And I'm going to cut some slashes in it. That'll help it keep its shape when you're baking freeform like this. And you know, I'm going to tell you now, I should have cut them a little bit deeper. They worked. The bread's held its shape. But it would have been prettier with a little bit deeper gashes. I have my oven preheated to 450 degrees. And I'm going to show you how we're going to make this a very crusty bread. I have a bottle of clear water here, and I've got it set on mist, and I'm going to mist the whole thing. Not enough to make it soggy, but just for a little bit of water, little water drops to float on top. Then I'm going to move it right into this 450 degree oven, and very quickly, because I don't want to lose my heat, I'm going to spray again. And this is going to simulate a steam oven, a professional steam oven, and it's going to make the crust a little harder, a little crunchier. If you don't want that kind of crust, don't use the water. And I set my timer for 5 minutes, and I'm going to squirt it again. Now again, you know, you may not want that much crust. The bread will be just fine without doing this, but I really like that crunch. 25 more minutes, and we're going for an internal temperature of 200. And after 30 minutes total, this is what we've got. I've got my little thermometer here. It's a little candy thermometer. And I'm going to show you we're going for 200 degrees. Anywhere from about 195 to 205 is fine. But you don't want gummy bread. And we're right at 200. So I'm going to put this on a rack and show you what we got. This has a nice hollow sound, and you can test that way, but a thermometer is better. We're going to let this cool for a full hour before we cut it. I can hardly wait. Okay, it's been an hour. Here we are. I'm going to slice this for you. And you know, as I said, if you want this more in the shape of sandwich bread, you can certainly make this it would make 2 cast iron pans full. And I'm going to cut it, and the bottom crust is pretty stiff. I want you to look at that. Isn't that beautiful? No gumminess at all. And that's because we were really careful not to overwork it, and we let it rise quickly in a warm spot. And now to top it off, I'm going to have some butter. I melted this butter just for this piece of bread. There are 100 rye bread recipes out there, and there are a dozen different ways to make it. This is how I like it. Lots of caraway seeds, crunchy on the outside, and I like it to be toothsome. I want it to have a little resistance when you bite into it. And to me, this is just perfect. So if you like your rye bread that way too, give this a try. You will not be disappointed. It just tastes marvelous. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. I really hope you try this rye bread. You're going to love it. Hope to see you again tomorrow.